Again, I think, thank all of you. I think we are living some of the changes in the planet that this lecture will be concerned about in part. This is, Shelley mentioned, this is the third and final lecture in this year's lecture series sponsored by the School of Continuing Education. As those of you who may have been able to attend some of the earlier lectures know, our theme for this year has been global health, and meaning health in the broadest sense, the health of individual human beings over our life course, the health of human populations in an all too fast changing world, the health of the non-human populations that human beings depend upon and with whom we share the planet. Among all the great universities of the world, you've heard me affirm this. If you've been at the other lectures, I'll say it again. Cornell University is uniquely positioned to speak to all of these aspects of global health. Cornell Wild Medicine, both in New York City and in Qatar, conducts leading-edge research in human health at every scale, from fundamental laboratory science to large-scale clinical studies across many nations. Here in Ithaca, the College of Human Ecology and the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences are homes to one of the nation's leading departments of nutrition, approaching human nutrition through multiple disciplines and at multiple scales, from molecular biology to international food policy. Our College of Veterinary Medicine is home to the Department of Public and Ecosystem Health and recently received an historic gift from Cornell alumna Lisa Yang to endow the Cornell K. Lisa Yang Center for Wildlife Health, which addresses key challenges at the intersection of wildlife health, domestic animal health, and human health. Our speaker tonight, Professor Kathryn Fiorella of the Department of Public and Ecosystem Health, is one of the core faculty members in the K. Lisa Yang Center for Wildlife Health. She is also a faculty fellow of the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability and a core faculty member in the Southeast Asia program and the director of the Food Systems and Health concentration in Cornell's Master of Public Health program. Professor Fiorella earned her PhD in environmental science, policy, and management from the University of California, Berkeley. Her research studies the interactions among environmental change and community well-being, food systems, and nutrition. Professor Fiorella's work in Kenya explores how Lake Victoria's increasingly frequent harmful algal blooms are changing lake ecology and putting fishing communities at risk of long-term exposure to algal toxins. Her related work with fishing communities in Cambodia finds that they catch and consume a much greater and more nutritious variety of food species than they sell into the marketplace. Understanding the real lived value of this biodiversity to these fishing communities will be important for projecting and adapting to the future effects of ecosystem change, not only in Cambodia, but around the world. Globally, Professor Fiorella and her colleagues argue, preserving and expanding a biodiverse aquatic food system could reduce food and nutrition insecurity and tackle malnutrition in all its forms, potentially preventing more than 160 million cases of inadequate micronutrient intake around the world by the year 2030. Doing the math, that leaves us less than 6 years to get that job done. So without further ado, let's bring to the podium Professor Kathryn Fiorella.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And again, thank you all for being here despite the downpour. So I'm going to talk today about how aquatic foods connect us all. And I'll talk about production from both fisheries and aquaculture, which increasingly the two pillars of this production. So on this title slide, I included photographs from Kenya, where I work around Lake Victoria. And I think a lot about aquatic ecosystems and fisheries, and particularly the people that work in and eat from these ecosystems, which is really all of us. So sometimes we think about the ways nature functions without people in it and the ways that people are degrading ecosystems. But for me, these are really reciprocal relationships. And healthy people and healthy ecosystems are intertwined. I think that's more and more something we recognize. And a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight is trying to pull at some of those links. How does it actually function? So I'm going to use the example of fisheries and aquaculture to hopefully convince you or underline for you that health and well-being of people and environments are really intimately intertwined. And this happens really integrally in our food systems. So I'll focus first on the big picture of what is going on with fisheries and aquaculture globally, and then we'll dig into some more specific research from inland Cambodia to think about this dynamic too. So I want to start by looking at this big picture of global fish consumption and where it's going. So this graph shows aquatic food consumption over time, which is the gray line here, alongside shifts in consumption of other animal source foods. And so the key takeaway here is that they are all going up. So aquatic food consumption is growing quite rapidly, as are all other animal source foods. So this is a big question of sort of this milieu of how are we going to provide sufficient food to people around the world? What is the environmental impact of that food going to be? What is the distribution of foods that are really rich in micronutrients, which animal foods are really critical for addressing nutrient deficiencies of all forms? What will the distribution of that look like? We know that wealthier people often consume more of these foods. The people who may need them most for dietary adequacy are poorer folks. And how do we balance that on a finite planet? So when we think about aquatic foods in particular, 70% of aquatic food consumption is in Asia. And in addition to being a unique source of omega-3 fatty acids, fish also contribute really substantial quantities of micronutrients. Those are things like iron, zinc, nutrients that we really need a lot of in our diets and many people are deficient in. And fish are also seen as this more sustainable option and a highly nutritious one. So models show that shifts to more fish consumption will reduce chronic disease and micronutrient deficiencies globally. So in some ways, this increase in fish consumption is really positive, potentially. So amid all of this growth in aquatic food consumption, reports globally are suggesting that we should be eating even more fish to meet our health and our sustainability goals. So this is a figure from a Eat Lancet report that was really looking at sustainable diets and how we can achieve them, and suggesting that we should, in most areas of the world, be eating more fish, that it will provide both for more sustainable diets and for better nutrient intake for all of us. So with this suggestion, there's really a question of where that consumption is going to come from. It's going to require a lot more production. Fish will need to continue to be harvested in really large quantities from wild fisheries, which you see here in blue. But they're also going to need to come increasingly from aquaculture production, which you see here in yellow. So aquaculture production now comprises more than half of global fish produced. And as you can see in this graph, it's rapidly growing. So it's the fastest growing segment of the food system today, about 7.5% annual per capita growth. In 1961, the global fish production was about 9 kilograms of fish per capita. In 2018, it was 20.5 kilograms of fish per capita. And when we look at these dynamics, you can see essentially that the wild fish production is relatively flat. And in some ways, this is a really good thing. It means that we are managing fisheries to continue producing a relatively similar quantity of fish. That's positive. We don't want to see this line going down. But it also, we know that most of the stocks being measured here are produced at or above their capacity. And so there's not much room for growth here, right? So all of the growth in supply is really coming from this aquaculture segment. So 90% of that production is in Asia, particularly China, but also India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Cambodia. And a lot of aquaculture production serves domestic urban markets. So I mentioned before, 70% of global fish consumption is also in Asia. The other thing that often surprises people is aquaculture is actually predominantly in freshwaters. 62% of production is freshwater production. And it's a much smaller diversity of fish than the wild species. So we have more than 31,000 fish species globally, and many of which are consumed in different regions. About 4 fish species make up a third of aquaculture production. So it's just a much more constrained number of species. So aquaculture is not new, and it's been exist for thousands of years, but this present scale is really quite different. It's a scenario where we're really starting to think about a space that's traditionally been a wild space, and we're farming it. So to give you a picture of what that can look like, there are a whole range of different ways these operations take shape. So this is the case of Lake Victoria in Kenya. And the big picture here is that this ecosystem, a huge lake, very comparable to the Great Lakes of the US, Africa's largest freshwater lake, Lake Victoria, is increasingly the site of these cage operations. So these cages sit on the surface, they go down anywhere from a couple meters to, up to 8 or 9, 10 meters down into the water. And most of these are intensively producing tilapia. So this one you can see here, these are imported materials and nets to create the cage itself. They import fingerlings and feed for these systems too. They're highly specialized, lots of knowledge and capital goes into producing in these kinds of systems. Right next to it is a recirculating aquaculture system. We also have one of these here on Cornell's campus, actually. Professor Eugene Wan has set one up, and these are systems where the water is filtered by continually circulating through the system, and it filters out the waste that come from the fish and allows you to produce a really high density of fish in a really small space. So a really interesting area for continued research. In this case, this is sort of a demonstration one. It's also in Kenya. And in a lot of cases, they're more and more coming up to scale, but tend to be relatively newer kinds of operations. You can also use the waste that these produce to grow vegetables. So a lot of times the water then circulates into aquaponic vegetable production too. So really neat and innovative systems here. On what is sort of the other end of the spectrum are these smaller scale operations. So this is a small cage made with local materials, also sited in Lake Victoria. These cages tend to be owned by an individual or a couple of individuals in a collective. These are much more the small scale version of this similar large scale cave. They're sited closer to shore. That's potentially a concern for things like water quality. It also means that they're a lot easier to reach without as big of a boat and things like that. This one over here is an integrated poultry operation. So chickens are reared in this coop here. They have a mesh floor, so their waste drops into the pond, fertilizing the pond, producing aquatic plants that the fish can then feed on. It's sort of a less intensive form of aquaculture here. So in highlighting this range of systems and starting to draw this continuum of possible production models, there's really a question I want to highlight about whether we support research development in some of these low-tech or high-tech segments is really going to affect who has purchased in these industries, what is produced, where that food goes, and their environmental impact. So there are certainly risks to getting a lot of small-scale aquaculture producers up to speed on things like biosecurity and managing for nutrient pollution that might be produced by cages. Likewise, there are risks from some of these really high-yielding systems that might be demanding tremendous amounts of things like feed, which is both energetically really costly and uses fish that people might otherwise be eating. So in all of these systems, I think thinking about sort of what the equity dimensions of who then winds up with the food that they produce becomes really critical threads of this. So in the US, our aquaculture industry looks a little bit more like this. So certainly a very high-tech industry. These are actually catfish production in Mississippi. So these are eggs, fry, and then eventually the ponds here. So the eggs produce the fry and the ponds. Catfish are reared in the US at the largest volume of aquaculture production. About 40% of US aquaculture is catfish. Globally, the US is a relatively small, minor aquaculture producer. We import instead about 70 to 85% of aquatic foods that are consumed in the US. So when we think about this big picture of sort of what's going on in global fisheries and aquaculture, some of the places that I'll talk about today are certainly very far afield. But these industries are really interconnected, and in fact, we are eating from a range of different systems around the world. So we can manage our fisheries and our aquaculture in one way, but to the extent that our impact extends to all of the places we're consuming from, it's really a global system and a global challenge for all of us to think about the sustainability of these systems. Okay. So so I painted a picture of aquaculture as this really big change that's happening in fisheries. And certainly the transformation of a lot of this wild space into a farm space is a really big thread of what's going on in global aquatic food production. But alongside that, there are a host of pressures on aquatic ecosystems. And so I'm highlighting here really the freshwater ecosystems. But many of these and other dynamics play out in marine systems as well. So the first one here is dams. So this is a network of planned and operational dams. So the planned ones are in yellow, the operational ones are in purple, along the Mekong River. So as it comes down from China, extends through Southeast Asia, the river flows are being really dramatically altered. So the implications of this for fish, many of which have a migratory life cycle, are really tremendous. So fish often need their eggs or their larvae to move along these river networks as a part of their life history. I'll talk a little bit more about what happens in Cambodia and this lake here at the very end of this chain coming up. But 80% of migratory fish have declined by 80% since 1970. So we're seeing the ways that we're shifting these landscapes, especially through things like hydropower, really having a big impact on many of these fish populations. And in a lot of cases, there's a very active research thinking about what the implications of this are. So if you build a dam, you create a reservoir behind it. Well, that is potentially a water body that also provides a source population of fish. But how does that compare, especially when fish are adapted to living in a river as opposed to your reservoir? So all of these questions very much playing out in real time with a lot of implications for the people who work in and harvest these fish. Other really big dynamics that we're concerned about a great deal are things like nutrient pollution. So this is a harmful algal bloom. We have these in Cayuga. This picture is from Lake Victoria as well. But the increase of nutrient pollution that comes from fertilization, from cities, from a whole host of sources really, but primarily those two, can lead to this excess growth of algae. So this has an impact on the oxygen in the water that the fish need, and the death of this algae also can really cause these dead zones that I'm sure folks are a little bit familiar with. And in addition to those oxygen dimensions of what can play out here, there are toxins that many of these algal species produce. And so some of the work my group is doing is trying to better understand what the uptake of those in different fish species might look like. And of course, those are also polluting waterways as well. Other really big threats to freshwater include introduced species. So this is Nile perch, which really changed the ecology of Lake Victoria by decimating the native cichlid species. Harvest pressure is a really big effect in a lot of cases, right? The fact that these are intertwined human and ecosystem questions, we're using these landscapes really actively. The fish are being withdrawn. That also has a really big impact on the ecosystem. And over here, I'm showing some of the thermotolerance shifts. Climate change having a big impact on fisheries around the world. I think we're really still getting a handle on in a lot of these systems and seeing what adaptations are possible. In marine systems, we see fish moving poleward for cooler waters, right? In inland systems, that is less possible in a lot of cases, right? There's nowhere for them to go. So exactly what the implications of that are going to be. We have some fish stocks that have benefited from climate, but many more that have seen challenges facing warming temperatures. Okay. So when we take that whole picture of the ways that these ecosystems are changing, and these counter forces, sometimes of aquaculture production, bringing a lot more fish into the system for us to eat, but also all of these environmental changes that are happening. We wanted to ask this question about what is the nutrient availability from aquatic foods, and how is aquaculture changing that potential? And so I'm going to outline a couple of ways that we think this is happening and some important considerations here. So I want to highlight that these are interrelated issues that shape the quantity of nutrients produced, but also the quality of them. So environmental impacts on aquaculture are ultimately going to shape nutrient access. So around Lake Victoria, these excess nutrients from aquaculture feed, sewage, agricultural runoff that lead to these blooms, shown in this top photograph, are affecting areas where tilapia are cultivated. So last year, they caused massive fish kills within the cages. And so while the blooms and anoxic conditions might be a factor in the kills, fish disease hasn't even been profiled in the lake and could also be a cause. So we did a recent survey of aquaculture farmers and found not only that the fish kills are relatively common, but that most farmers aren't practicing sufficient biosecurity. Things like cleaning your net between different ponds. So for example, if fish are found dead, most cage farmers report that they throw them outside of the cage. So you can imagine how that might lead to disease spread if the cause of the fish dying is a pathogen, right? And likewise, antibiotic resistance and efforts to treat disease in open systems is also a really common concern that needs to be really carefully monitored. So this is another way of thinking about kind of the environmental impacts that might come from these systems. So we have threats that are external, and we also have threats that some of these production systems might generate as well. And they highlight the vulnerability of some of these systems and the range of health issues that might extend beyond the actual foods that they're producing. So we should be thinking, especially in a new animal agricultural system, a lot about zoonotic diseases and antibiotic resistance, and things that we've seen in some of our terrestrial animal systems have been areas where we've needed to think further about. So we have a lot of opportunity to learn from some of these other systems as we start to farm more and more aquatic systems too. So I also wanted to highlight concerns about the inclusion of fish-derived resources in aquaculture feeds. So this is a sustainability issue because it affects the efficiency of the systems and how resource intensive they are. But it's also very much a nutritional issue because a lot of times it's food-grade fish that are becoming feed. So the quantity of fish that's been included in feeds is falling, actually, really fast. So that has a couple of implications. So first, it affects the nutritional profile of the aquaculture fish that are produced. So the omega-3 fatty acids that contribute to fish being so nutritious are taken up from the diet of the fish. So fish that are fed on grain, for example, have lower quantities of those nutrients. And second, the fall in use of fish in feeds is a positive thing in that the efficiency of aquaculture production, if fewer edible fish are becoming feed, is improved. It makes it easier to produce fish, and it means you're taking less fish to do so. So the challenge here is that even if the percentage is much lower, as aquaculture grows really fast, you're still potentially by volume, this may be a pretty big concern if the quantity is going up, even if the per fish quantity remains lower. So the image you see here is of daga from Lake Victoria. So this is a small pelagic fish species. It is typically eaten whole, which means that people are getting a lot of the micronutrients that are in the bones, the calcium in the head, and it's also a relatively affordable fish, so as a lot of small fish are. Women play a really substantial role in the value chain of harvesting this fish. They are usually harvested and then they need to be sun-dried. So that highlights a really important gender dimension. But daga is a really vital food source. And in fact, in past research, I found that not only the quantity of the fish, but also the species of fish consumed affects the fatty acid concentrations in breast milk for people who are consuming these fish. And I also found that participating in fishing as a livelihood doesn't have this effect on fish access. So rather, it's income from fishing or other sources that determines fish access. And fishers are often selling higher value fish and buying daga to consume for their families. So within fishing communities where fish consumption's historically been really high, the future of fish access can really depend on which species are available. So daga is exactly the kind of fish that gets turned into fish meal for aquaculture species. So whether this fish continues to be available for the relatively poor consumers that are mostly eating it, or whether it becomes a commodity that then goes to produce fish that are more expensive that they struggle to afford, is a real question of sort of how the system ultimately plays out. So looking more broadly, in a review of fish nutrient composition, we highlight that many relatively low value fish provide really high nutritive value. So for example, this is looking at vitamin A, and we can see that many fish are meeting the recommended nutrient intake for vitamin A with a single serving. And these are compared to fish like Atlantic cod and Atlantic salmon that provide almost no meaningful quantity of vitamin A. So this isn't so much to harp on cod and salmon, which do have a lot of beneficial nutrients too, but to point out that fish species are really different. So whereas we might think of chicken or beef as relatively similar, there are of course some differences there too, but they're much smaller, right? The diversity of fish species actually provide us with really different things. So when we trade off between species, we might be glossing over some of those really important differences that are really key things about the biodiversity of these systems that we should continue to think about. And we've also found that in addition to providing these high nutrient values, small pelagic fish tend to also be relatively abundant. And this is partly due to their role in the ecosystem. They turn over quickly, they tend to produce pretty fast, and they tend to be highly affordable. So we did some work in low and middle income countries looking at small fish species across and seeing that in a lot of these cases, the small fish are those same species that are being targeted by small-scale fishers, highly available to poor folks, and also the kinds of fish that are being targeted for potential inclusion in aquaculture feeds. So staying with this topic, there's also a risk for ecosystems in trading off wild fish and farmed fish that we're seeing in some of these different shifts that we might be examining as this food system simplifies some of what's available, right? If we're producing a lot of the same aquaculture species, turning our more diverse wild species into feed, we get this shift in the ecosystem. And there's also a nutritional risk for people. So work led by Sebastian Palpern, who is a postdoc in the Peruvian Amazon, shows that a shift from wild fisheries to chicken and aquaculture species could reduce the iron and DHA supply, DHA being an important omega-3 fatty acid, but it might have benefits for zinc supplies. So these graphs show the diversity of wild fish in gray across nutrient composition values compared to the aquaculture species in blue and the chicken in brown, which underlines these trade-offs. So fish just offer us this much greater diversity than some of these other kinds of species. But there's also some good news in these areas, which is that fish are what they eat, and so their feed really matters. And there's been a lot of innovation in what the feed could look like. So these are omega-3 camelina, an oil seed that is really omega-3 fatty acid rich, increasingly being integrated into fish feeds, potentially improving the nutritive value of the fish produced through aquaculture without needing fish as the ingredient. Likewise, black soldier fly larvae can be fed on organic waste, and they similarly can be leveraged to do this kind of circularity of the system, feeding on waste, improving sanitation thereby, while also diverting nutrients that might otherwise find their way into waterways as nutrient pollution, and producing aquaculture feeds in this way. So there are a lot of possibilities, and I think the way we think about where the effort goes into what kind of technologies and how these systems get developed and adjusted is really going to matter. So I think these are really promising and exciting arenas for additional research. And an investment in them can potentially look a little bit different than continued investment in the intensity of some of the production systems. So coming back to this diagram, I also wanted to touch on the diversity of species produced and the potential nutritional implications for that. So aquatic foods, very diverse, as we have touched on, and that diversity comes and nutritional diversity alongside it. So some of these foods are exceptionally high in important micronutrients. And to illustrate how environmental change and shifts in available biodiversity are already having an impact on global fishing communities, we're going to jump into a case in Cambodia. So Cambodia has the 5th highest inland fish harvest, the highest per capita inland fish harvest, and many of these inland fishing households getting upwards of 50% of their income and their total animal protein from fish. And as I mentioned in the diagram I showed before, Cambodia is one of the last stops on the Mekong River. This is it coming, let me show you here. This is the Mekong River coming down into Cambodia, and this is the Tonle Sap Lake. And so every year, the Tonle Sap flood pulse swells the lake from rainwater and the water from the Mekong in this annual flood pulse that provides for fish productivity, essentially. And so fish migrate out from the lake itself into the surrounding ecosystem, this floodplain ecosystem where they eat, where they breed, and are caught in a lot of cases. And this system provides for a really incredible biodiversity. So the Mekong rivers and this region's biodiversity, second only to the Amazon globally, 135 documented fish species being caught in these rice field fisheries that surround the lake, and a whole host of behavioral guilds, so named for the type of water that they're swimming from. Whitefish are long-distance migrants that like the clean, clear water of the lake. Gray fish are shorter distance migrants, and blackfish live on the floodplain year-round in murkier water. So this is some of the blackfish, and they can essentially make their way between water bodies, as you can see by the challenge of trying to keep them in this basket. They're tough fish and really can essentially spend a lot of time out of water and walking around too. So highlighting some of the range of species that we have, and a lot of these blackfish are really prized species too for households to catch. So in the system, we use this photo voice methodology, which is a participatory qualitative research method where we ask participants to take photographs based on a prompt. And so we worked with the participants to develop the prompt we used, which is, what is the story of fish diversity in your life? And so we trained participants on the process and taking photographs, focusing especially on things like ethics, making sure not to include people's faces in the photographs, things like this. And then we gave everyone a camera for 5 to 6 days, and then we returned to ask them which photographs they wanted to share and what they wanted to share about them. And so this led to a lot of questions about sort of what is in the photograph and also what's not in the photograph that maybe the eye doesn't see, but is an important part of the story. And so this is a suite of photographs that people shared with us. And I think what really stands out to me about these is just the tremendous biodiversity of the species that people are surveying and took pictures of. So this really rich array of biodiversity corresponds to a rich array of nutrients. And these photographs were taken by both men and women in Cambodian fishing households. So a quote that the person who took this photograph shared was, "It represents our good health. We have energy. Fish have good vitamins. I feel happy when I get to cook as food for our everyday life. When I get fish to cook as food for our everyday life." This person shared, "The biodiversity surrounding my community provides me enough variety of fish to support our livelihood. Therefore, we don't have to buy food from outside sources." So people were really proud of this biodiversity and their fishing livelihoods, but they also really noted a range of challenges that they faced in them. So this photograph, which I think when I saw this picture, I thought this is a really beautiful photograph someone took of their child. But what they said about this photograph is, We caught only a small quantity of fish. I'm upset when I think about making a living from this. The fish that I caught don't even fill up the container. It only filled up the bottom of the container. And someone else, when we asked about this question of fish diversity in their life, they took this picture of their rice fields and said, I love this picture because this year I grew a good amount of rice. I didn't catch anything because the water level in the rice fields is too low after I harvested the rice. So really focusing on this other thread of their livelihood and a piece that was more productive from their standpoint. And so I think these comments from folks and the other suite of things that they shared about us really painted this picture of an uncertain future for freshwater ecosystems and foods. So there's this representation of a really rich diversity of fish and other aquatic animals that people value and they catch, and a diversity of meals and favorite dishes. Also, people really sharing that livelihood challenges were very highly place-based, so people that were right next to the fishery that had few alternatives felt really constrained, whereas people that were further away from the Tonle Sap Lake, who had more opportunities for fish production and other kinds of commerce, felt like they had alternatives. And people highlighted a range of challenges about the management of the fishery, the seasonality of it, perceptions about people fishing illegally who had more gears and manpower to catch fish. So there's a lot of concern about the conflict between a small-scale sector and people that were fishing in more mechanized ways. And this quote really encapsulates that. So says, I want the government to make sure that there is no illegal fishing because we have a reduction of fish. Because they use big equipment to fish, that's why we don't catch a lot of fish. My net is laid in one place, their net is used to chase fish all the time. I'm afraid it can never get better. If the government is really good, they will find a way to prohibit the use of bigger equipment in fishing. And so I think the challenges that folks are facing in these fisheries go back to many of the things that we talked about right at the beginning, that these are finite resources. We have a lot of people that are dependent on them and need them for their food and their income. And these small-scale fishers, like these folks, harvest 2/3 of the global fish in the world. So people like this fisher right here are really critical to our global food system and aquatic foods. So it's a not insignificant amount of quantity that are being withdrawn in fisheries that are like this one. And so we were really motivated by what we learned in this photo voice research to think about the biodiversity of aquatic foods further. And really try to understand what the benefits of that biodiversity are for people's health, and what do we risk if it's lost. So there's a lot of reason to worry about the loss of biodiversity, and in freshwater ecosystems in particular. So we are in the midst of a really large downfall in biodiversity, and the point of this graph is to really highlight that freshwater biodiversity brings the whole graph down. So marine systems, 36% loss, freshwater systems, an 83% decline in global biodiversity since 1970. So really staggering numbers here. Of course, this network of dams on the Mekong River, really big piece of the concern in this system. And more broadly, thinking about this wild food use and nutrition, I'll highlight a few things about why we think this might be important and why we wanted to ask this question. So the quantity of fish produced really matters, but as I've mentioned again and again, the fish aren't interchangeable. So the actual species that are available to people really makes a difference. And food biodiversity has been linked to nutritional adequacy of diet. So we often think about this in the USDA My Plate or the food pyramid kind of perspective, right? The multiple kinds of food groups that we're eating. But we're more and more seeing actually that the diversity of species that we're eating in those groups improves dietary adequacy and micronutrient intake as well. So in some ways, the macro groups are a relatively coarse way to think about this. But there's more and more evidence that biodiversity is really important in these groups as well. And so that in agricultural settings and crop agriculture has motivated people a lot in a lot of cases to think about, okay, well, how do we increase the production diversity? So this literature looks a lot at how the diversity of crops that people grow impacts the diversity of foods that they then eat. Bearing in mind that, just as I said, there are hundreds of thousands of small-scale fishers in the world, also millions of people practicing small-scale agriculture. So in a similar vein, thinking about this diversity of what people produce, how does it relate to the diversity of what they consume? And so what that literature has generally found is that for people well connected to markets, what they plant has relatively small or no impact on what they consume. So if they have poor market access, it can have a larger impact. But in wild systems, these dynamics are really opaque. And so we wanted to ask this question in fisheries about how does the biodiversity in the ecosystem affect the biodiversity of what people actually make use of. And the other, I think, important reason for this question is that if we don't know what the biodiversity in the system is, which it's often really hard to know how many species are out there, and it's also actually really hard to know individually when people catch fish, what species are they, how much are they catching. So what we tend to do is use the commercial species to stand in for this information. And we say, what's being sold, how much is being harvested at some of these more commercial sites. And so that can potentially simplify what's going on in the ecosystem. So the question we're asking here is about when we have the biodiversity of the ecosystem, so these fish swimming around here, people then catch a segment of that biodiversity. They make a lot of decisions about whether they're going to go out fishing, how long they're going to spend, what kinds of gears they're going to use. And then once they've caught that fish, they decide, are they going to eat it or are they going to sell it? They could potentially also decide to preserve it or trade it, but we're going to simplify it to this. And so we looked in communities that were around these green dots, which are fish refuges. So the government of Cambodia implemented fish refuges in order to try to increase the access to fish in these floodplains, and they're community managed. And so they serve as our picture of what's in the ecosystem. Although they're connected hydrologically, they're not being fished themselves. And we also looked at household data from the communities that surround each of these different green points, about 400 households. And then we looked at the ecological traits of the fish too. And so looking at this, the relationship that we found in 1A here, we found that on average, the catch biodiversity includes 45% of the species available in the regional ecosystem. And average consumption of biodiversity includes 43% of the species in the ecosystem. So in other words, people are catching and consuming a pretty similar set of species. But average sale biodiversity includes only 9% of ecosystem species. So we also find that species households are selling tend to be more common, larger, and less nutritious compared to the ones that they consume. And a lot of this has to do with the relationship between the size of fish and the micronutrient density of them and the price. So larger fish tend to get higher prices, so people sell those, and they keep the smaller fish, which tend to be more micronutrient rich in large part because of the way they eat them and eating the whole fish. So these relationships were really remarkably stable. So even when we take into account differences between households, the fact that the amount of biodiversity in the ecosystem influences the amount that people catch and consume remained really steady. And we also found using statistical models that the number of species in the ecosystem is statistically significantly influencing how many species households catch and consume and sell, even though the numbers I'm showing you here are the averages. And so the other key finding here was that households that are poorer tend to use more species. So highlighting another way that the biodiversity might be providing a safety net in these systems. And the big picture is that these are in this case, the species that we know the most about by far are the ones being sold that are making their way to markets and through commerce. So really highlighting the importance and the possibility of what we might be missing if we don't think about the bigger picture of biodiversity and the real nutritional benefits it might be providing households. And so at the outset, I said that I was hoping to use the example of fisheries and aquaculture to convince you or underline for you how the health and well-being of people and the environment is intertwined. And I hope that you'll see both how food system transformation through aquaculture expansion offers a risk and potentially an opportunity too, as well as how biodiversity impacts well-being and how we need to think about that even as we're watching these food systems transform. So even though we live far away from a lot of the fisheries that I talked about today, I wanted to also close by showing you this global trade in aquatic food. So U.S. fisheries have been really quite well managed over the last 30 years, but we're importing somewhere around 80% of the aquatic foods. And I think this photo really shows the way that the global trade of aquatic foods interconnects us with places very far away and their systems as well. So these are really big systems, and as consumers and eaters, we are all important actors in them. And I think a lot of times they can feel like big structural pieces, but I think there are things that we can do in them. So we can start by recognizing how interconnected we all are. In most of these systems, we play a role in driving consumer demand for different products, and we get to make choices in them. So when you eat aquatic foods, you can try to choose a diversity of foods. You can try to choose low trophic level foods, so things like sardines or mussels. And also consider the labor practices and sustainability of those systems. So admittedly, this is not an easy thing to do, actually. Good information about aquatic foods can be hard to get. There is intentional and unintentional misrepresentation of them in a lot of cases. There are more and more certifications that are trying to help guide us in these directions, though. And then I think the other takeaway, or a challenging takeaway for all of us, is that the portrait of farmed aquatic foods is a ever-evolving one. So this landscape is changing really quickly. There's a lot of potential for these to be sustainable and circular systems. There's also a lot of potential for them to be harmful in other ways. And so it will be a place to continue to watch. And I don't have a clear picture for whether they're good or bad to consume. So with that, I want to conclude by thanking you all so much for your attention today, and thanking the partners on this research, the Center for Commerce Studies, World Fish, and the Kenya Marine and Fisheries Research Institute that I work with really closely, as well as the funders of much of this work, the National Science Foundation, National Geographic Society, Cornell Atkinson, Cornell Center for Social Sciences.